Hi everyone, I'm going to do a final, let me just check my sound. My sound is up. I'm going to do the final video for the course. For week 8, I'd ask you if you had requests, and there were no requests, so I just selected something which we had not discussed. So something which I think we need to also consider in your portfolio and in your reflection is the examination of self as a consumer and producer of research and writing in terms of flavor, register, level of language in various academic writing formats. So something from experience I find that graduate students are having difficulties in adapting to often is, first of all, as consumers of research, getting used to the various formats of research, the various flavors of research, being able to determine what is a relevant source when really we can't just rely on what vehicle it comes in. It's not just about the journal anymore. You have to use judgment and be able to find where, what is a pertinent source of research. So often students have a lot of reflection to do on self because they can have presumptions about what they consider to be academic writing or formal writing or writing of quality. And often they need to go through that reflection, that analysis to widen maybe their to widen their sort of perspective on this. And then as producers of research, it's the same thing as well. Sometimes we're caught in fairly narrow vision of what academic writing should look like. It's going to be particularly difficult for you as you start in the master's degree to make sure that you are hitting the target spot on, but that you're not being over formal, over sort of rigid, or over technical, over jargony. And so there's a bit of analysis as writers to be done there as well. So we're on the fringe of our main issues for the portfolio, but they're nonetheless very important reflections, and often they do connect with reflection on self, because I think it connects back to the imposter syndrome that we discussed. We're so keen to look like we're hitting the target that sometimes we overkill, and it's a reflection therefore that becomes important, so we don't become something that we're not, and we don't write in a way that's not suitable simply because we're trying to impress, or we're trying to make sure that we fit into this academic world. So that's where I think this discussion fits into discussion on self for this course. So today we're going to explore the nature and format of tone of reliable academic sources. See, as consumers, how do you make those distinctions? What guidelines are you using? What criteria are you using? To what extent does your subjectivity come into it? And then in second sort of part, we're going to look at the various voices that appear in academic writing. And that's going to be important because you are going to have to find your voice. So this is important not just in terms of consuming, but in terms of producing, and then hitting the mark and not hiding yourself behind things that sometimes you feel you have to sort of hide. And then explore the way research distinguishes itself from academic writing in terms of language and terms. So that's running through. If it's not the formality, if it's not because it's rigid, it's not because it's jargony. So what makes good academic writing? An interesting topic, I think, for all of you to think about as you finish this residency and the 3 branded courses. So the nature, format, and tone of reliable academic sources. How do we determine that something is reliable? In the past, we would have gone to a number of journals, and that was very easy. You looked at international peer-reviewed journals. You looked at their own ratio because they have factors. You look at the factors. You knew if it was a reliable journal, and that was it. But those times have changed. And we have now many different sort of sources of reliable writing. So I'm going to read from the slide a little bit. As education moves from a purely positivist approach to research to a more phenomenological approach, we have to consider reliance on peer-reviewed journals as a sole reliable source. So this notion of the objective researcher who writes in a journal, who adopts an objective stance, writes in a third person. That was all very suitable for positivist research. But phenomenologists, as you have seen with me when we discuss theory, in phenomenology you are centered. It's a subjective construction of reality. Therefore, the author is going to be central. They're not going to hide behind a third person. They're going to write in the first person. So once academic writing is starting to be in the first person, some of you battle with this. It's going to be much more difficult to make a distinction between what is pertinent and not pertinent, because there's all going to be bad writing or bad sources out there. So in terms of evidence-based research, literature review will still, of course, rely on peer-reviewed journals, but they may these may be phenomenological in nature rather than quantitative. These may involve case studies, studies involving very small samples, narrative studies. We're going to see some examples today of narrative methodology, ethnography. So when you are considering, and we've discussed this during residency, when you're discussing writing that sometimes you have done, such as journals and or notes on your experiences, and then you're revisiting that and analyzing this in a qualitative way. The literature review is qualitative phenomenological studies will seek to identify the pertinence of a topic to the field. So this is important because a word that often I see graduate students use, they talk about validity, right? And there's a danger there because that's the word we've learned. So we talk about validity, but validity is only pertinent to quantitative methodologies. And I hope you've seen this word buy-in. So that's a criteria which is very specific just to that sector of methodology. You can only look at validity in quantitative. In qualitative, there's no such thing as validity, because validity really refers to the notion that you have used sampling and specific ways of building your quantitative analysis, that the sample is representative of the whole world, and therefore there's transferability between your results and the whole world. So whatever phenomena you are analyzing within that sample, you're then able to broaden and say this is a result or a conclusion that's valid for the whole world. That does not exist with qualitative. Qualitative does not function on the notion of that once you've identified something, it's transferable to the whole world. Because if you work in phenomenology, for example, it may actually only be useful as an exploration to that specific group who constructs reality in that specific way because of this very specific variables or lived experience. So validity is going to be no good for us. So instead, we're going to look at relevance to the field, pertinence to the field, richness of data, right? Other criteria. You're going to see there's about 10 criteria that we use in qualitative methodology that are going to come up a lot. But this doesn't make your life easier as graduate students, because it's not easy to determine that just from the tone or just from the flavor or just from the writing. So you're actually going to have to go deep into the article to then be able to determine whether it is pertinent to the field, whether it is relevant to practitioners, whether it is rich data or not, and whether the analysis is sound or not. So this increases your, from my experience, the lack of comfort the graduate students have when they look at writing that they've never seen before, and they have to quickly assess whether it's a reliable source or not. So their relationship to writing and formal writing becomes really confused and really difficult, and often leads to a lot of soul searching. To add to that, many academics these days produce writing that aims to inform the field, but does not take the shape of the journal publication. So academic videos, blog, podcasts, websites, we have really completely and entirely changed the way we disseminate research. So very well-known academics will, of course, still submit to journals, but they sometimes submit, first of all, to open source journal, open access, OER, journals that are not just in libraries and open access on the net, but also now they're getting very creative. So films, to an extent, we seem most likely to succeed as almost a little piece of research, right? It could also almost be a little bit of action research. There's certainly things that you might consider in your capstone project in 610 that might very well be produced in terms of results and findings as a video or as a small film. So films, academic videos, blog, podcasts, websites. So when you're confronted with those, this is going to be even more difficult, because when you have a blog, how do you, as a graduate student, determine whether it's an academic blog, it's not an academic blog? How do you draw a line and a stand between what's of quality and pertinence and what isn't? It's going to be very difficult. So I'm sure you are entering into soul searching, and it is raising difficult questions. And this is why this last reflection on this course is going to be important. So what I suggest is that the notion of reliable source should be a spectrum rather than, let me see what words I had behind there, than a clear concept and neat delineation. So journal articles in education, obviously, but you're also going to be looking at journal articles in other fields: sociology, anthropology, ethnography, media studies, communication studies. We talked about interdisciplinarity. You are going to be working often in interdisciplinarity in other fields. I teach a course at the moment within College of Interdisciplinary Studies or Royal Road. You have people taking masters and taking PhDs in interdisciplinary studies. So they will be using education, but they will be using literature from many other fields. The difficulty for you is that the flavor in those journal articles is very different. We've already discussed that the citing mechanism is different. So often those journals are not writing in APA. So therefore, they're writing, it's not just a citation, the writing style is not APA. The presentation is not APA. The flavor and the way of writing is not APA. So you are going to be confronted with things that are not identical to what you've been introduced to, and you are going to still have to determine whether it's of quality or not, and whether it's reliable or not, and something that you want to use. Then you have news features, print and web-based, national, provincial, regional, schools, school board newsletters. So a lot of things being produced by school boards, by the provincial authorities, ministerial authorities, but also, and I need to add them to the website, but I talked to you about educational magazines, for example, which produce a lot of things often which tackle research or linked with research, but it's not in a formal journal. You may still want to cite that. This may well still be reliable. So I'm sure by now you're starting to have quite a bit of anxiety as to, in my master's and in my future writing as a researcher, what do I include, what do I not include? That is why there's so much soul searching, and that's why you've got to look inside and tackle your assumptions and tackle your defense mechanisms, because sometimes we push back and we're actually very defensive against things that we're not used to. And that's why, again, I think it's part of this important reflection on self as you finish this unit. Academic videos, blog podcasts, and websites, and we discussed this. So all of these are on this spectrum, and all of these may or may not be reliable sources, and you're going to have to use your judgments. So obviously, I'm going through everything that I've itemized just now. You have a journal article here. This is about CP critical pedagogy. I'll let you read this. The question I have, I've used this face-to-face in class. What are the main features of this kind of writing? It's this is a typical journal writing. So often, as students, you have less difficulties with this. It's also writing that comes from the field of education. So it's very much clones the sort of principles that we've been sort of hammering about APA. You can see that every time an assertion is done, you have a citation. You can see that the tone, the writing is in the third person. You can see there's this sort of objective stance of the observer, which is the objective researcher observer, which is adopted. The level of language is formal. The choice of words is appropriate to the sector and to the field. I think you've seen most of the examples there. So the world would be easy for you as graduate students if all reliable sources were of this type. But there's also writing from other fields, right? So this may have a different flavor as we've just seen. So here's, I'm going to read this for you. Let me just move my camera. Okay, critical media. So this comes from communication studies, I think, field that we often have to explore when we're writing education. Critical media education is sometimes represented as the land of the hand-wringers who decry pleasure and insist on mediation on the ideological workings of consumer media. We believe this is simplistic and instead position ourselves as taking political economic perspective in which pleasure and analysis are seen as equally important. In this time of media conglomeration, we cannot afford to be merely playful. Educators need to engage students by analyzing that which is playful as well as engaging in an ideological analysis of that which is serious. I have difficulties reading this even. In other words, educators need to give students the tool to understand both how and why the media reports on issues such as war and curtailment of civil liberties, as well as how to foster discussions about what makes the latest shows, internet sites, and computer games pleasurable. Kind of think you're going to encounter often, and you see here that the writing is very different. Not the same reliance on in-text citation, much more rhetorical, and almost direct engagement with the reader, sometimes being sort of really trying to convince rather than just presenting information. And this is something that you'll find, and it's still a reliable source. It just comes from a field that's different than yours, right? So when you overlap and when you're doing interdisciplinary research, you may be confronted with things like this, and you have to analyze your reactions, right? So that takes me back to this analysis within this course. How do you feel? How open-minded are you about digesting information that comes in different formats that is still reliable but may not come packaged in the way that you're used to? And it sort of gets worse. Here I've given you examples of blogs, academic blogs, and of no, blogs are coming later, but this is sort of print and web based, and this comes from the Guardian Education. So these are obviously things that you could still cite. They obviously often carry things that are very facts and information and views that are very pertinent to the field. We can often use them definitely in papers. You would definitely be citing the Guardian Education, but obviously it's very journalistic. So the fact that it's journalistic, writes very different etiquette and follows very different sort of criteria, does not mean that it's not pertinent and not a reliable source for us in education. Then we have blogs. This is a blog from a colleague that was presenting at the conference I just went to in Boston. A lot of people in the field that are educators write in blog style. Blog is supposed to break all of the conventions that we have in academic writing. It interpels the viewer, the reader. It talks to the reader directly, often will use the first person. It's going to be lively and engaging. It's going to, aim to concisely what an article would do in 5,000 words and do it in 300. It's going to be to the point. It's going to be, fast and lively. So for all these reasons, you may, as young graduate students, disregard it, and you may, in fact, have to return on this and revisit and say, actually, why am I disregarding sources that really I should be considering as reliable? Because many of the professionals that you're citing in journals, articles, are also writing blogs, and they're pretty much talking about the same things, except they're doing it in a different format. Sometimes the blogs are more up to date, they're more to the point, they're more digestible for you, so they should not be a source that you set aside. Yeah, I think I'm just sort of rehashing here things that we've already discussed. So what I'm going to do next is also look at journal articles, and not actually just articles, just writing. Actually, I'm going to put myself up there with the camera. So I've got 4 vignettes, and I'm going to read through them, and then I'm going to ask you what's the nature of the writing: academic journal articles, website, blog, educational press. So as a little girl growing up before the era of cable movies on demand, video rentals, or home theaters, nothing was more magical than a trip to the movies. One of my favorite companions on these excursions was my grandfather, who had worked in theaters from the time he was old enough to make popcorn. He explained the lure of films in this way. Girlie, we go to the movies to see life the way we'd like to make it. You know what we learn from them? Ourselves. A couple of decades have passed since then, and movies remain a great influence both in my life and in society at large. Films about teaching and learning seem to be perennial favorites, but in recent years there's been a shift. Instead of being awed by noble, nearly omniscient teachers who single-handedly transform the lives of their fortunate students, audiences are watching teachers and students co-construct learning, redefine text, and work together to challenge the status quo. So I'm not going to tell you yet. I'm going to tell you at the end of the 4 vignettes. So decide for yourself. Takes a few minutes. Is this writing academic or journalistic? Is it reliable? Does it come from journal article? Does it come from website, from blog, from educational press? Vignette number 2. My classes were arranged into 7 50-minute periods into a day, with approximately 25 students per class. Classrooms was well stocked with large whiteboards, projectors, and a computer for every student. My students were ages 11 to 13, and my classes were predominantly in white, with only 3 or 4 students of color in each class. Brand names such as Hollister, Abercrombie & Fitch, Victoria's Secrets, and Under Armour were prevalent. Students came to school with iPods, iPhones, and other gadgets that were contraband in most school settings. However, here, teachers were encouraged to incorporate them in their curricula. In general, the students liked so many middle school kids were energetic and willing to engage, but they weren't particularly curious. For example, during the introduction of the class, I mentioned it is important to ask questions, to be skeptical and curious about the world. Abby, one of the most popular students, wrinkled her nose and said, "Why? I don't get it. The world is just the world." At this point, many of the students nodded their heads in agreement, and I recognized the majority of the students. Demonstrated a passive naivety about the world. So again, same question. I've got 4 of those. I'm going to run through them and I'll give you the answers. Try to guess the nature of this writing. Give you a few minutes to think or pause the video. Is it academic? Is it reliable? What do you find is reliable and why? Is it a journal article? Does it come from a website, a blog, educational press? I'm not going to read the whole one of this because you'll probably get it from part of it. I'll just read half. What happens to society when thinking is eviscerated and is disdained in favor of raw emotion? What happens when political discourse functions as a bunker rather than a bridge? What happens when the spheres of morality and spirituality give way to the naked instrumentalism of a savage market rationality? What happens when time becomes a burden for most people and surviving becomes more crucial than trying to lead a life with dignity? What happens when domestic terrorism, disposability, and social death become the new signpost and defining features of our society? What happens to a social order ruled by an economics of contempt that blames the poor for their condition and wallows in a culture of shaming? So, same thing. What's the nature of this writing? What's its flavor? Is it academic, do you think? Do you think it's reliable and pertinent source for us in our field? Do you think it comes from journal articles, a website, a blog, educational press? I mean it 4. The students went silent, anticipating the next sentence from the scripted lecture, and now everyone was following onto your page. As soon as he spoke those words, the African American teacher of an urban middle school looked at me and said, "This is what has become of school. This ain't what I signed up for." With this interaction in mind, the conversations we had after his class, it is apparent that this struggle to meet the state standards amidst the hyper-accountability associated with the current trends in education is not what he signed up for. Displaying his frustration with the scripted curriculum that he was expected to deliver, he believes that the building principle was attempting to beat the creativity out of his teaching. So again, same thing. So last exercise, is this academic right? What flavor or what type of writing is this? Is this academic writing? Would it qualify as a pertinent source, a relevant source, a reliable source? Is this from a journal article, from a website, from a blog, from the educational press? Right, so the aim of this is you probably got it wrong, and it's not about getting it right, but it's about confronting the reasons that made you think one way or the other. And this is why this is important in your reflection as self in terms of consumer and producer of research and writing, because you are probably going to have to confront a lot of your implicit biases and presumptions with regards to academic writing. And it's normal. Again, I think it's highly linked to this notion of imposter syndrome that we've discussed at length. And I think as graduate students, often we overcompensate. So we only accept as reliable source things that look fairly pedantic, and they don't have to be. And actually, the world has changed, and research findings are disseminated in many, many ways, many critical, creative ways. And you are going to have to use your judgment to find them where they are, regardless of the signpost that has been or the label that's put on them. So let's go through that. A little girl grew up in cinema. So this is a journal article that I've used in courses. I've got it in the references so you can find out for yourself. It is this one, Hodges, 2010, a critical close-up, 3 films and the lessons in critical literacy. So actually it's a journal article, and a journal article that comes from our field, from education. It uses first person, it uses narrative methodology, and it uses autoethnography. So she looks at her own life and her own experience and experience that she has with film. Number 2, that one is a journal article too, and in our field as well. So the second one is, let me just remind myself, it's this one, Smith 2013. I've used all of these in classes. Covered critique, critical pedagogy under the radar in a suburban middle school international journal of critical pedagogy. So it's a regular standard international journal and a journal of education. Something that is obviously completely fine despite the very descriptive and narrative methodology that is adopted, and therefore that is tangible in the writing, and that probably puts you off. This one, because you got a hyperlink, you probably thought, this is website. It's obviously breaks all of the conventions too. It's addresses the reader. It's fairly rhetorical. It's persuasive. It's not trying to be balanced. It's trying to be persuasive. It's got a lot of passion. So obviously, we would say not academic, right? We'd probably say it's journalistic or even maybe a personal blog. it's this one, Giroux, 2016, Thinking Dangerously in the Age of Normalized Ignorance. So it's, again, Giroux it's open access and it's very different, but Henri Giroux is probably the lead writer. He works at Brock University, he's the lead writer in critical pedagogy. You've heard of Paulo Freire. We discussed Paulo Freire. He's the sort of surviving heir of Paulo Freire. He's probably the most influential sort of academic writer on critical pedagogy. And because he writes in critical pedagogy, he likes to break the mold. So he refuses to submit to the traditional journal. He uses web and open sources for the vehicle for his writing, because he thinks we need to ask ourselves questions about traditional methods of dissemination. And he wants to break the status quo, as we've discussed. And his way of breaking the status quo is to break the sort of etiquettes of academic writing. So obviously this one's probably shaking you a little bit, but he's someone that obviously reaches light all the time, someone who's extremely well known. So this is an added notion that you have to look at the vehicle, you have to look at the credibility of the author sometimes, and the targeted audience. So your choices really are going to get very nuanced, and you're going to have to, they're always contextualized. You're going to have to look at them in context, never just as a universal sort of judgment that you can have. And then you have this one, it's probably through you, because you, again, very narrative and includes direct speech, and doesn't shy away from using the vernacular that the characters are actually using. Again, it's a narrative methodology, but it is a journal article too. It's this one, which I've used in classes too. Simmons, Carpenter, Ricks, Walker, Parks, and Davis, African-American male teachers and African-American students working subversively through hip-hop and through urban schools. International Journal, Critical Pedagogy, International Ranked Journal, totally fine to cite, nothing out of the ordinary. But obviously the flavor of the text is probably completely thrown you, and it's not what you traditionally see or expect to see as a graduate student in terms of writing. So I hope you found this useful. It really was meant to shake you out of these assumptions and to get you to think about, what I'm basically putting forward as an assertion is that there are no more clear signposts. Therefore, as a consumer and as a producer of research and writing, you are going to have to work on self. You're going to have to work on your assumptions, your presumptions, your views, your ways of doing things, and maybe you're going to have to change them. You're going to have to be more open to things. You're going to have to develop this little radar that enables you to find quality writing that is of academic reliability, even when it doesn't come in the forms and the shapes that you expect. And that's part of the great big reflection which you start as a graduate student. So everything we've discussed really in terms of consumer, you can now sort of flip back and using your reflection in terms of producer, because as you start writing papers, you are starting to be a producer of research. And then you'll have obviously that big section to do in the capstone projects in 610. So importance of finding your voice, just as you're developing that nuanced radar to determine what is reliable around you in the writing, you are going to have to find a nuance in producing a voice that is authentic, that is academic, but that avoids the traps and the sort of ready-made ready-made pitfalls of sticking to an etiquette or sticking to certain rules. You're going to have to develop that flexibility that you see in others in your own production, in your own writing. Just as I've talked about your credibility of the person, target audience, and the vehicle, you are going to have to think of that too. So important to reflect on your target audience, on your context, on your methodology as well, because as you've seen, methodology often pushes you to look beyond the traditional sort of methods. A lot of people who work in qualitative methods break the mold when it comes to writing, but they do it in a careful way. They do it in an academic way, but they're still breaking the mold. You're going to have to develop awareness against jargon over sophisticated academic writing. So again, I think the imposter syndrome often, because we tell you use syntax citation, think as an academic writer, follow these models that we're seeing, you're going to have a tendency, it's like a swing. I find students go full swing to over sophistication, over academic sort of pompousness, and it almost becomes pedantic. And then you're going to swing back a little, and then you're going to find your voice somewhere in the middle. So obviously it's new to you. It's normal that you do this swing because you're being very careful and you want to make sure that you follow the guidelines. But then you're going to have to make sure that you swing back and you find your equilibrium there, something that's still you, that's still authentic, that still reads well, and that avoids that. So in effort to avoid jargon, try and not use, fall into the pitfall where you are writing that you like the way you sound. It's something that often people mistake as being academically sound or academically reliable. That's not it. There's actually a lot of bad writing out there that's over pedantic, uses jargon too much. So jargon is the use of technical words when you don't need to use them, and that's a no-no in academic writing. We actually always want you to always assume, and I've said this to you before, that your reader has no technical knowledge and they have no understanding of what you're talking about. So you explain your concepts, you define them, you explain them in simple terms. If you have to use technical terms, you introduce them and define the first time. That's only if you have no other choice. So keep all that in mind. That's what's going to keep you sort of balanced and finding your position on that swinging pendulum sort of process that we all go through. Keep your writing fluid, read other things than journal articles, and export that freshness into your academic writing. So I remember my PhD supervisor, who was great, said to me right for the last year, make sure you read crime thrillers. And she meant it. And she was like, we get so stuck in being a library and reading stuff that's very dry and not always great writing. But that's not actually what we're looking at academic writing. We actually want it to be fairly fluid. We want it to be engaging for the writer. So obviously, we want to stick to that reliability, and you have to be careful of what you say and how you say it. But sometimes there's some great sort of freshness from reading other things that we can export back and actually use to make your writing engaging and make your writing fluid and make your writing appealing. Reach the right turn. Sorry about the typo there. R-I-G-H-T, obviously, not right line, right turn in level of language, but avoid complexity and technicality. So we're back to the notion of jargon and avoiding that. Again, it's a trap that your next instructors are probably going to have to rectify, and then we'll rectify in 610 if it's not completely out of the way. But it's a normal process, I think, that all graduate students go through. Overkill. And then we have to rein them back and say, actually, you can remain authentic and genuine and fluid in your expression while, respecting the guidelines that we're giving you in terms of what makes academic writing. Always use lay terms, never presume technical knowledge on the part of the reader. So all of this leads you to also an understanding of these expectations within a cultural context. So you are in a university that's Anglo-Saxon, and I've taught in other fields and I've taught in other languages, and this is not always the case, but the Anglo-Saxon attitude to and relationship to language is very specific. So to give you an example, when I taught, and for some of our colleagues that are elsewhere, they may understand this because it may be the same, in Eastern Europe. I was school in the French system. I went to university in France for 2 years. I came back and I started in the UK, and it took me an awful lot of time to get the A's in the French system and to understand what they wanted, which is over-conceptualization, long sort of papers. In a French paper, the relationship to language is such that you conceptualize from the first, and you may spend pages and pages defining a term and then conceptualizing, and then maybe at the end you are going to talk about something that's actually pertinent to the field and relevant to someone in terms of hands-on practice. In the Anglo-Saxon world, not just in education, but in any writing, we do the opposite. We start with our hands-on, we have a very pragmatic relationship to language, and then we conceptualize towards the end if we need to. Which means that this notion of plain English is really important. And often when I do a graduate seminar in graduate studies, I go and extract even documents from the SEC, from the Securities and Exchange Commission, from the Stock Exchange in New York, that has a guideline about plain English. So this really permeates the whole of the legal system, the legal sector, and financial sectors. What we consider plain English, again, is this notion that don't be long if you can be short. Don't be complex if you can be simple. Don't be technical if you can use lay terms, and that you do this systematically. That you have this sort of pilot light at the back of your mind that reminds you that whatever you produce, you then go through it and you simplify it to the point that it can be. You don't oversimplify, but you don't overcomplicate. You keep it as simple as it needs to be, and also that you keep the writing as concise as this. So you don't go on and go on and go on, and sometimes when we correct you, when I say this 5-line sentences cut that, that doesn't work in English or in an Anglo-Saxon relationship to language. Again, it does work in France. You can do 12-line paragraph sentences in French and 100-line paragraphs, and that's totally fine. So beware of all this and keep this in mind, because when you're producing against that authentic voice, it needs to be fresh, it needs to be clear, it needs to be concise, it needs to be to the point. Now, you're still conceptualizing because you're working graduate level, but there's ways to conceptualize and keep things simple, as opposed to entangle the reader in sentences that are really difficult to follow, and that's what you never really want to do in academic writing. So I'm sure you're seeing what I'm talking about, because I know that all of the students I've ever guided through masters always hit that wall. And there's this tendency after the first semester to start being over complex and a bit pedantic and have these long sentences and to lift, right? You're not copy pasting, but you're lifting kind of sentence terms of sentence, or ways of expressing things from things you're reading, and then before you know it, you're crafting stuff that's a little dense and doesn't have to be as dense as that. So then it's your duty as a producer of research to go back and simplify that. You keep the rigor, you keep the importance, you keep the key elements, you keep the conceptualization, but you simplify the language itself. The language should be a vehicle and should be as simple as possible. The best academic writers are people who talk about very complex things and very conceptual things, but they talk about it in lay terms and they talk about it in simple ways. So that's it. That's all I had for you today. But I think it's an important part of that reflection, and you may have a few things that you want to add into your portfolio discussing this. So I thought it was important that we have it as an addition to the course as we finish. We have a collaborate session at 4:30, so we'll be talking probably some of you about the e-portfolio. I'll speak to you soon.